Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And tonight we welcome back one of our guests and favorite, one of our friends of our show, David Borris from Chicago Area Peace Action. David, it's a pleasure to have you back on the show. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Kevin. Thanks for inviting me.
So Chicago Area Peace Action is actually a group that's been around for a long time, but that's a new name for the group, isn't it?
Yes, so the Chicago Area Peace Action, there was a Peace Action Illinois chapter for 10 or 15 years that failed to sustain itself about 10 years ago when the head of that organization became the executive director of National Peace Action, Kevin Martin. Our organization was North Suburban Peace Initiative, a 30-year-old organization founded really to work on issues around nuclear disarmament, nuclear abolition. And we started a conversation a little over a year ago talking about the necessity to really start to move out of several issue silos that we were working on out of Afghanistan, out of Iraq, and nuclear abolition, and start to connect all of these issues into an overarching conversation, really revolving around economic justice, which kind of ties all this together. Interestingly enough, so this has sort of been fueled now by the Occupy movement. So
particularly Occupy Wall Street, and here in Chicago,
sure.
Occupy LaSalle Street.
Absolutely, right. Occupy Evanston, Occupy Northwestern, and you know what the match that they lit, September 17th in Zuccotti Park is really become a wildfire, I think.
Well, let's talk for a moment about this knitting together, and having, as you know, spent time myself with various peace action groups in Chicago, particularly in the run-up to the Iraq War. One of the things that I saw, and I'm sure you've seen, the meshing of all of these different threads it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it can say, yes, there are connections between these ideas and these elements, but it can also distract from the core message. And if we take, for example, Occupy Wall Street, the core message there, as much as anyone in the movement will admit to a core message, appears to be economic injustice, that, listen, the 1% control the government, they control the corporations, they control the wealth, they control the agenda of the country, and the 99% seem to have little to say. That appears to be the core message, which is a powerful one. Does it get diluted? By trying to tie all these other ends together, do you dilute the central focus?
I don't think so. I think that what's interesting is if 2 years ago you had asked a public sector union member whether or not their job depended on reducing the $200 billion in the pipeline for new nuclear weapons over the next 10 years, whether or not their job depended on us finally extracting ourselves from the quagmires in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think they would have looked at you and thought that these things were totally disconnected. Maybe politically they thought that, but it certainly didn't have a direct impact on their job. Well, you ask them now, and they get it, and they understand it.
Because of the economic meltdown.
It's because of the economic meltdown and the understanding that you can't continue to devote those kinds of resources, and you can't continue to allow really what's become a global oligarchy to suck the resources out of everything to direct them to the places, to misdirect them really to the places that they do. And so I think what we're really starting to see, and it's not a new message, it's just a message that hasn't had vibrancy for over 40 years, and it's, I think, what King was talking about in 1967.
Martin Luther King, right?
Yes, in his speech at the Riverside Church, when he says, what we must undergo a true revolution in values, a radical revolution in values, right? We must rapidly begin the shift, he says then, we must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When computers and machines, profit motives and property rights are more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism cannot be conquered. And I think if there were a treatise for Occupy, that could be it.
Let's come back to the idea of a revolution in values. Some of the pundits have drawn very loose comparisons between the Occupy Wall Street movement and the Tea Party. The commonality I would suggest is that both talk about a revolution in values. Do you think that both of these movements are either touching the same chord in the public or may in fact be motivated by the same kinds of senses of injustice? Are there commonalities here that should be explored, or are they really different things?
Well, here's what I think is interesting. So the commonality is that they're both expressions of moral outrage. The difference is that I believe the moral outrage that the Tea Party represents is moral outrage that their tribe is being asked to participate in community. The moral outrage that Occupy Wall Street's expressing is that a narrow group of individuals is not allowing communities to stand for what they are. I think that a big part of the Occupy Wall Street message is that we should be a community, and when productivity rises and when innovation occurs, that it should lift all boats. It's a travesty that 60% of the increase in productivity or in GDP in this economy over the last 8 years, 60% of that has accrued to 1% of the population. So they really have divergent messages, whereas with the Tea Party's concern, it seems to me, is, oh my God, we might have to actually share what we have, right? It isn't right for government to stand to help all of us. We should just take what we have, and if you're, Tea Party and Herman Cain, very similar messages, right?
Which would be?
Which
what?
is, if you're not rich, it's not anything around you, blame yourself, right? And if there were maybe a true free market, if it really was a free market, it's this myth of a free market, but it isn't. It's a government that's owned in many ways by the already wealthy who use their influence to continue to further enrich themselves. And then...
Well, let's come back to that for a moment. There was a campaign talk. Elizabeth Warren, who's running for Senate in Massachusetts,
Yep.
And who had helped form the Consumer Finance Protection
Yep.
Agency, was caught on video cam at apparently a house gathering, a house party kind of gathering for her candidacy. But explaining, I thought, in it, you may have seen this, went viral on the internet.
That's great.
Is saying that, okay, if you created a company and it's made a lot of money, that's great, you should get the rewards to that, but don't ever lose sight of the fact that you move your goods to market on roads that we all pay for.
That's right.
The people who work for you are educated in public education systems that we all pay for.
Correct.
The laws that allow you to do business and protect the sanctity of your contracts are a result of the democratic government that we have all helped create and help fund. And your success is not standalone by any stretch of the imagination. You could only be as successful as you are with the environment that we collectively as a society have created, and therefore you owe something back to that society that allowed you to be as successful as you are. Do you think that sums it up?
I think it sums it up wonderfully, and I think that really the conversations, there's a couple of important conversations we should be having. One is, if you're going to internalize your profits, then you should internalize your costs also. So privatize your profits, privatize your costs. What we see are companies
and your risks
that externalize their costs, right? They want to take the money out of society, but they don't want to pay back for what society has given them. And I think that Elizabeth Warren put it exceptionally well. The other conversation that we don't have anymore, that we used to have in the 20s, in the 30s, and the 40s, when we passed legislation like the Sherman Antitrust Act, was, profit is a good thing. And if we're going to have any semblance of capitalism, yeah, I think incentive, profit motive unleashes innovative thinking and ideas.
And I think we should stop just for a moment to mention that you yourself are a business owner.
I am a
right?
business owner, yes.
So you understand that you go into business
business
to make money, and you work very hard to make your business successful, right?
Right. But what we don't talk about anymore is fair profit. What's a fair profit? And at some point, taking more out of the system as it continues to disadvantage more and more people. I think the pharmaceutical companies are a great example of that. You get a 7-year patent on a drug, they get an additional 7 years, and then they go and they lobby for yet more. Now they'll argue, look, we put $1 billion into the pipeline to develop 6 different drugs. Only one of those drugs is going to succeed. So we have $6 billion invested in this one drug. So we say, well, all right, so maybe you should make $12 billion. maybe you should make 14 billion. But 30 or 40 billion, or whatever those numbers are, it isn't fair to not allow further innovation and further development, which is what those extended patents kind of do.
But I think we would want to be careful in that argument that if we were to say a certain dollar amount is okay and above that is not okay, I would think that would run a risk of, first of all, how would you ever pick that line? And then once you did, under what circumstances might there be exceptions where you would have to deal with it? So we're not really talking about dollar amounts or percentages, right? Are we really
Correct.
talking about what's a more fair structure?
Correct.
Where more people have the opportunity to be successful. Now, along those lines, let me ask you what you may think about the impact of technology and some of the recent writing about the continued high unemployment, which many economists ascribe as to the the lingering effects of financial crises, and the fact that a crisis of the magnitude we had 3 years ago frequently results in high unemployment like this for an extended period. So that historically, it's understandable. But another element is technology and how technology has automated so many jobs and how it continues to automate ever more complicated jobs. For example, in the legal industry, where usually or formerly there were armies of paralegals and assistants and junior lawyers who would go through all these documents prior to a case to mark off, well, this is relevant to the case and this is not relevant to the case, called discovery. And now those 500 employees can be replaced by 2 or 3 with a computer system that will do all of that for you. And these are high-paid, high-quality jobs that have been eliminated. So as we talk about this fairness and as we talk about money accruing to capital rather than labor, where do we factor in that technology component?
Well, I'm not sure I have an easy answer to that question, but I think that one of the things that needs to happen in government is an understanding of a more fair tax code. And this is something that we've seen has been an extremely, an intransigent Republican Party in Washington that refuses to have that conversation. And if a law firm is able to, by laying off employees, is able to increase their bottom line by several $100,000 or several $1 million, should that money slide up to the top 1 or 2% of the lawyers working in that firm, while they don't pay additional taxes on money that's earned over $1 million or over $2 million or over $5 million, which is something Warren Buffett was talking about, right? That people need to pay their fair share, and if the markets are going to push that sort of dollars into the pockets of a narrow few, well, then wise tax policy can, and I know this sounds anathema to the Ayn Rand crowd, but wise tax policy can help redistribute some of that money so that we can use it to train people and to help people.
And let me focus on that word for a moment, because that word redistribute is a volatile word. And if we go back to our earlier discussion about the Tea Party versus the Occupy Wall Street, redistribute is one of those code words to the Tea Party that says, you're going to steal from me to give to some other undeserving sucker who doesn't deserve my money. I do. So how should that concept, how can that be discussed without triggering, well, particularly without using the code word redistribute? What other concept can that be framed as in terms of social justice or in terms of fairness that doesn't sound like I'm going to reach into your pocket and give it to someone who doesn't deserve it?
Well, I suppose we could talk about it in terms of investing, right? So when we talk about giving grants to students to go to school, students who can't afford to go to school, I mean, that's investing in our economy, right? When we talk about giving veterans coming home from serving overseas opportunities for job training and opportunities, again, for education, I think those are very pure investments in our economies. When we make when we take amounts of money that would be available to be distributed through community banks as loans to small entrepreneurial businesses, where government takes on some of the risk there because we're still stuck in a bit of a credit crunch like that. Those are investments in growing our economy out of the disaster that frankly was created by greed, avarice, lack of transparency, government regulators who failed in their duties, but they didn't fail in their duties out of negligence. Those government regulators failed in their duties because they were relatively coerced to not act in those interests, right? The Commodity Futures Trade Commission, if you read Simon Johnson's book, 13 Bankers, if you read Matt Tabay's book, Griftopia, it's clear that these big behemoth Wall Street banks, they wrote letters, they talked to people, they lobbied to get regulations twisted, relaxed, and overlooked. All legal, but all completely immoral.
Well, in fact, speaking of the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, I'm sure you're familiar with Brooks Lee Bourne, the woman who headed the commission about more than a dozen years ago, who warned of derivatives then.
Absolutely.
And the powers that be, these very wealthy interests, had her removed as the head of that agency because she wanted to regulate derivatives. And her warning was, this will blow up the economy sooner or later.
And she was right.
She was dead on right. So if we're going to deal with this kind of very difficult situation and address the fundamental concern that Occupy Wall Street is looking at, the injustice, the control of all the levers of power by a small few, what kind of steps need to be taken? Aside from the, at least, and I will say that Occupy Wall Street has been very successful in changing the discussion in the country. If they do nothing else, they've been hugely successful at that. But how do you take the next steps? Do you have a concept of how that should unroll?
Well, I think it's really difficult. I think the issue that underpins all issues, and it sounds sort of mundane, but is campaign finance reform, right? And in the wake of the Citizens United decision, that becomes even more difficult. I think that it might be Dick Durbin. The Senate has just introduced, and it isn't going to wind up passing, but the concept, the only way to override that is with a constitutional amendment. And I know that the Senate, Dick Durbin was part of introducing an amendment to the Constitution that would effectively negate, and I haven't read it, but it would effectively negate the Citizens United decision. You need to take the money out of politics to a degree. You're never going to get it completely out. But there needs to be a recognition that there is far undue influence. And as people start to realize that, and I hope start to listen to the message that the Occupy movement has, we can start to shift the thinking in general. I mean, at the end of the day, people are governed by consent, right?
Yes.
And if there's enough moral outrage and enough recognition, then things can change. But I don't know that there is a pure quid pro quo path.
Well, let's shift gears quite a bit at the moment. I know you've come back from a recent trip to Israel-Palestine.
Yes.
Very interesting. You shared some observations before the show with me. So can we talk a little bit about your experience? First of all, how you got there, what the organization was that took you there, and what you come back with.
So an organization that I became exposed to through my work with Chicago Area Peace Action as we sort of gingerly deal with the Israel-Palestine issue. So an organization called Hands of Peace. They're a Glenview-based organization that have been in business for 10 years, not for profit. And what they do is they bring Palestinian and Israeli teenagers over to the United States for 2-week homestays during the summer with American teenagers.
So a Palestinian and Israeli will stay together in a home of an American?
No, some Palestinians will stay with American teenagers and some Israelis will stay with American teenagers. And there's some interfacing that they do during the time that they're here. I'm not really that familiar with the program, but I became familiar with the organization because they were putting together a tour with just adults, many of which were part of the program. They had been homestay parents, and others were just people who they knew, and I bumped into Gretchen Grad and Laura Bernstein and folks that were very active in that through my work with Chicago Area Peace Action. They told me they were putting this trip together. I said, I want to be in on it, and the thing that really hooked me was they said, this is a little bit different trip. It's a dual narrative tour. And the organization they use on the ground in Israel and Palestine is called Mejdi. They've only been in business a year and a half. So we had a Palestinian guide and we had an Israeli guide.
And when you talk about the dual narratives, each of those different guides gives you a different perspective on what they think has happened. What's the history? What's the nature of the conflict? What's the path forward?
Right.
And I would imagine those are very competing narratives.
Very different.
Not
yes.
much overlap?
I think there's some overlap. And I think there's reasonable overlap in that they both sort of acknowledge the tragedy of what's happening, and they, in many ways, I think, like in a lot of intransigent conflicts like this, the middle gets held hostage by the extremes on both sides. But the extremes matter because the extremes are generally born of deep trauma. And you know, on the Palestinian side, they've lived under, you know, so even from day one, from 1948, the Israelis call it the Day of Independence, the War for Independence, and celebrate it. The Palestinians call it the Nakba, the catastrophe.
Right. The great tragedy.
The great tragedy. And I think from 1948 to 1967 is sort of a different conversation, but I think without question, from 1967 forward has really been, I think, the tragic situation. And as we move through the West Bank, which up until 1967 was, you know, Jordanian territory, right? Yeah, but after 1967 became occupied territory. The Israelis never chose to annex it. They didn't mean ever to annex it. They meant to occupy it until they could work out whatever they were going to work out. And now here we are 41 years later, and 44 years later, 67 to 2000.
44, yes. Right.
44 years later, and it's still insoluble. And I think what's happened to me as we traveled through, for me, as a secular Jew, growing up with those Jewish values. I mean, I remember walking out of school on that June day in 1967, you know, feeling this tremendous pride, right? And, you know, finally, you know, we were able to stand up for ourselves, and finally we're able to throw off the yoke of being threatened constantly and constantly and constantly. And you had all of these feelings that well up that say, this is the strength that we need to have. So, but over 44 years, you know, suddenly you realize that by not solving the situation of the Palestinian state, we've become this aberration of what I grew up believing my Jewish values were, my social justice values are. And it sucks the heart out of the country.
Do you believe, as former President Jimmy Carter had said in his book a few years ago, that there's a form of apartheid that goes on there?
It's such a loaded word, and it's such an inflammatory word. I don't think there's any question that, yes, it exists, whether we label it like that or not. I'll give you an example. I'm talking to Gretchen about the teenagers that come over here. So, and it gets very complex over there, right? And with Zone A, Zone B, and Zone C, and with Israeli Arabs. So let me just say quickly, so there's Israeli Jews, right? Israeli citizens who are Jewish. There's also Arab Israelis who have full citizenship. They stayed in Israel proper after 1948 in villages, towns, and cities, and they have full citizenship. And then there are Palestinians living in the occupied territories. Well, when they bring these three different groups of people over here for summer homestays, the Israelis and the Arab Israelis both fly out of Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv. They are treated completely differently as they go through security screening procedures, however. So these Arab Israeli teenagers watch the Jewish Israelis sort of sail through security while they are subject to much greater degrees of interrogation and questioning and that sort of thing. Meanwhile, the Palestinians from the occupied territories have to drive to Jordan.
They're not
to
allowed
fly
to
out
fly.
of Amman, or they're not allowed to fly out of Ben Gurion Airport. So those kinds of feelings, yeah, I think it's hard to not describe it as
certainly unfair, right?
Certainly unfair, and I know that that's such a tough word, apartheid, but yeah, I don't think Jimmy Carter was wrong to bring it up, and I don't think Jimmy in the book was saying this apartheid society. What he was saying is, and I can't remember the exact title of the book, but he was saying is it apartheid? You know, let's
look at
talk
this.
about what's
Let's
really happening.
recognize that there's something fundamentally amiss here, and that it's reminiscent, at the very least,
Right.
of what has happened in
Right.
South Africa.
Now, at the same time, and as I had this conversation with some people, because, you know, it's very easy, I think, you know, we're hardwired to root for the underdog. We sort of, you know, we look at the Palestinians and their plight as people that haven't been treated necessarily fairly. On the other side of the coin, though, I think that, you know, we went through Yad Vashem when we were there, and understanding the deep trauma that that's put on Judaism worldwide. It ends, of course, in 1945 with the end of the war. But the other piece is, you know, in 1973, let me say it this way, that the United States of America could have a September 11th incident every year for 10 years. We could have had it every year for 10 years, and it would have been deeply tragic and deeply moving. But none of those incidences combined even together would be an existential threat to the United States of America.
Wouldn't threaten our existence as a
wouldn't
country.
threaten our existence. When those tanks were coming across the Sinai in 1973, and pressure from Syria and pressure from Jordan, in the first 5 or 6 days of the Yom Kippur War, that country felt a true existential threat.
And of course, now in retrospect, it seems like the Israelis won hands down, but in the early days, it was not certain at all
It was not
who would
certain at
prevail,
all.
correct?
And it was frightening. And not just a threat that their country would be taken over and occupied, but a threat, as I talked to a 28-year-old Israeli medical student, I said, you know, you guys really had this trauma. You're going to lose your country. He said, lose our country, lose our lives, right? I mean,
because this was all-out war at that time.
this is the fear.
And the difference between civilian and military targets gets very blurred in that level of warfare,
Sure.
right?
And they've never, I don't think that, you know, their psyche is not fully recovered from that trauma. And you have to give them that credit to say, if you're going to establish this Palestinian state, you have to understand that there has to be some sort of mutual respect, which comes, I think, more from Fatah now, but certainly doesn't come from Hamas.
So we have only about 30 seconds left.
Okay.
So in that time period, what would be the short message that you have coming back from Israel-Palestine to tell Americans?
I would say support J Street, support the two-state solution, understand that if we can't get the two-state solution done properly, then the great 60-plus-year-old dream now of a Jewish democratic homeland will be lost.
Frightening words. I hope that that's not the outcome, and we'll trust that our better spirits will prevail in this and our crises at home. David, thank you so much for coming back on the show. I hope you'll come back again sometime soon.
A pleasure.
It's always
Thanks,
a pleasure
Kevin.
talking with you.
Thank you.